Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Misunderstood Jew, the Church, and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus by Amy-Jill Levine, narrated by Donna Postel. Introduction. When I was a child, my ambition was to be Pope. I remember watching the funeral of John the 23rd and asking my mother, who was that man? I understood very little about him, but I did learn from the television coverage that he lived in Italy, had a very nice white suit and a great hat, and everyone seemed to love him. My mother responded, "That's Pope John the 23rd. She, like most Jewish parents, was familiar with then Cardinal Roncalli's efforts to save Jews during World War II, as well as with his convening of Vatican II, the gathering that finally condemned the teaching that all Jews everywhere were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. Thus, she added, he was good for the Jews. I immediately decided I would be Pope. It meant lots of spaghetti, great accessories, and the job was good for the Jews. "I want to be Pope," I announced to my mother. "You can't," she replied. "You're not Italian." Clearly, for a variety of reasons, I was in desperate need of instruction regarding the relationship between church and synagogue. My parents explained to me that the church, in my neighborhood there were no Protestants, so the church meant the Catholic Church, used the same Bible that we did, but whereas we in the synagogue read our texts in Hebrew and used scrolls, in the church Christians read their texts in English and used books. Further, they told me that Christians thought a Jewish man named Jesus was extremely important. I only later, and painfully, learned that because of these distinctions, and others, the separation between Jews and Christians was much more complicated. I was raised in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, a suburb of New Bedford, in a neighborhood that was predominantly Roman Catholic and Portuguese. Thus, my introduction to the church was through ethnic Catholicism, and it was marvelous. Feast days and festivals, pageantry and mystery, food and more food. I loved Christmas trees and Easter bunnies. I sang Christmas carols in the school choir, although, like a number of Jews in similar settings, I typically only mouthed words like Christ and Jesus. And although hesitant to admit it, I found Silent Night a much prettier song than I Had a Little Dreidel. My favorite movie was, appropriately, The Miracle of Our Lady of Fatima, a 1952 production starring Gilbert Rowland, and as Lucia, the girl who had the vision of the Blessed Virgin, Susan Whitney. I couldn't decide which would be more exciting, to have a vision and become a nun like Sister Lucia, or to elope with Gilbert Rowland. When I was 7, this early fascination with Christianity came to a head with two events. First, I became insistent upon making my first communion. All my friends were preparing for this special event, and I didn't want to be left out. My desire was not motivated by religious fervor, or even religious understanding. I lacked both. Rather, I wanted the dress with the matching white patent leather shoes. To provide me some consolation, my mother bought me a wedding gown for my Barbie doll. I'd dress Ken in his groom suit, with the jacket on backwards, and with white construction paper for the clerical collar. Then, practicing what I learned from my friends, I'd have Barbie, in her bride dress, take communion from Ken every morning before school. Second, that year a friend on the school bus said to me, "You killed our Lord." "I did not," I responded with some indignation. Deicide would be the sort of thing I would have recalled. "Yes, you did," the girl insisted. "Our priest said so." Apparently, she had been taught that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. Since I was the only one she knew, I must be guilty. But at the time, I did not understand the reasons for the charge, or have the means to address it. I was convinced that priests wore special collars to keep them from lying. Since the priest wasn't dead, the charge had to be true. When that horrible trip from school was finally over, And thank heaven these were the 1960s, when mommies met their kids at the bus stop. I was in hysterics. Calming me down, my mother learned what had so traumatized me. She assured me that my friend had misspoken. Calls were made, and, to the enormous credit of the local diocese, this hateful teaching was stopped. But I had become obsessed. I initially concluded that the priest had misinterpreted his Bible. It must have been a translation error, I thought, since even in second grade I knew from Hebrew school that it was easy to make a translation error. So I decided I'd learn to read the Christian Bible. No one told me it was in Greek. Find the problem, solve it, and then go on to do other things, like learn how to knit or to establish world peace. That was 43 years ago. I'm still working. The following year, by the way, was the publication of Nostra Aetate, the Vatican document stating that all Jews are not directly responsible for Jesus' death. I also asked my parents if I might attend catechism with my friends. I had Hebrew school 2 days a week after school. My friends had catechism the other 2 days. So my parents agreed. As long as you remember who you are, they said, go learn. On occasion I'd go, and I loved it. When I couldn't go, I'd pump my friends for the stories they were learning, and I'd listen to Sunday morning Mass on television, whenever I could skip Sunday school, to get more details. My general reaction to gospel stories was one of familiarity. Jesus meets a woman at a well, and concerns about marriage emerge, just as with Abraham's servant and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, Moses and Zipporah. Jesus is a good shepherd, just like David. Jesus fusses at priests, just like Amos. Jesus tells parables, just like the prophet Nathan and a number of rabbis whose stories appear in post-biblical Jewish sources. Jesus heals and raises the dead. So too Elijah and Elisha. Jesus survives when children around him are slaughtered, just like Moses. I didn't have to read Matthew chapters 2 through 7 to know that the rescued baby would take a trip to Egypt, cross water in a life-changing experience, face temptation in the wilderness, ascend a mountain, and deliver comments on the law. The pattern was already established in Shemot, the book of Exodus. Nor was the cross strange. The story resembled that of the deaths of the Maccabean martyrs, the mother and her 7 sons, whom we recall at Hanukkah. Making the connection even closer, these Jewish martyrs also anticipated vindication and resurrection. 2 Maccabees states, "The King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws." Chapter 7, verse 9. Written by Greek-speaking Jews, the books of the Maccabees were preserved by the Church. They are found today in the collection known either as the Deuterocanonical Writings, the Catholic designation, or the Old Testament Apocrypha, the Protestant designation. Later Jewish texts would retell the stories of the Maccabees, and the synagogue would continue to celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah. Both church and synagogue recognize the exemplary mother and her 7 sons. The irony is we Jews celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah, but the Church preserved the earliest records of the events that form the basis for the holiday. The description of Jesus' suffering recalled for me the accounts in the Yom Kippur martyrology of the rabbis executed in the Second Revolt against Rome, 132 through 35 CE. They also faced the power of the empire and did not falter in their faith. The death of the innocent was, moreover, part of my understanding of the Shoah, the deaths of millions of Jews at the hands of the Nazis. Jesus even complains about those who want the best seats in the synagogue. Matthew chapter 23, verse 6. I have been known to do the same. I don't recall hearing anything negative about Jews per se, save that I didn't like the fact that the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan was a bad guy. I am a Levite. I took that parable personally. But my initial impression of the New Testament was that it was a collection of good Jewish stories told by a good Jewish storyteller. And my initial impression of Christianity bolstered this positive impression. my parents had told me that the church was like a cousin to the synagogue. We worshipped the same God. We both believed in the Golden Rule. Christians and Jews also shared many books of the Bible in common, although I believed at the time that Christians had to work harder because their Bible was longer than ours. My friends had welcomed me into their homes, and they answered as best they could the questions I asked. They took me to Mass with them, usually on Saturday, after skating at the now-defunct Lincoln Park roller rink, to the 5 p.m. service at St. Julie Billiot Church on Slocum Road in North Dartmouth. It was not until I was in high school that I actually read the New Testament. The Gospel of Matthew started off just fine, a genealogy with 5 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. Nothing wrong here. Then came the virgin birth, the Magi, the temptation, and the Sermon on the Mount. But as I continued to read, I began to see all too clearly where that priest had found his hateful teaching. Verses such as Matthew chapter 27, verse 25, the cry of the people as a whole that Jesus should be crucified and that his blood be on us and on our children, provided the rationale for branding all Jews at all times Christ killers, and therefore for killing them. The Gospel of John, with its repeated use of the word Jew, seemed a litany of hate. Peter's sermons in Acts about the responsibility of the Jews for Jesus' death, chapter 2, verse 23, chapter 4, verse 10. Paul's statement in Romans that the Jews are enemies of God for the sake of the Gentiles, chapter 11, verse 28. 1 Thessalonians comments about the Jews who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and displease God and oppose everyone, chapter 2, verse 15. The list went on, and the pain continued. Yet I had fortunately been inoculated against seeing only hate. My Christian friends had modeled for me the grace and friendship that are at the heart of the church. My parents had told me that Jesus was a Jew speaking to other Jews, and that his basic message was exactly the same as that of Judaism, to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So I knew that, although the New Testament could be read as being anti-Jewish, it did not have to be read that way. Unless we Jews understand the beliefs and practices and histories of our Christian neighbors, and unless Christians understand Jews and Judaism, we'll never achieve the shalom, peace, that the children of Abraham, including Muslims, all claim to be seeking. Thus I write not only as an academic who teaches New Testament in a predominantly Protestant divinity school, but also as a Jew and a member of an Orthodox synagogue who recognizes the beauty of the Christian tradition, the harm that has been perpetrated in its name, and the several means by which its basic, important messages of justice and peace can be heard anew. Further, I am convinced that interfaith conversation is essential if we are to break down the prejudices that have kept synagogue and church in enmity, or at best tolerance, for the past 2 millennia. In other words, I am placing my scholarship in service to personal, pastoral, and even political ends. That, of course, makes me biased. But being biased is not the same thing as being wrong. Jews and Christians can and must talk to each other. Although all interfaith dialogue is educational and salutary, Jews and Christians have a number of special reasons for engaging each other. It is sometimes said that Judaism is the mother religion and Christianity the daughter. But church and synagogue are better seen as siblings fighting over the parent's legacy. Who are the true children of Abraham and the heirs to the books of the Bible, the law, and the prophets? Who followed the correct path and who veered off? Christians must engage with Jews, since Jews are explicitly mentioned in the scriptures of the church, and those references have had substantial repercussions throughout history, most of them bad. Jews should engage with Christians, not only because the early history of the church is the history of Jews as well, but also because the synagogue and the church developed in dialogue and debate with each other. The break between the two traditions began not at the cross or the tomb, but centuries later. Looking back, behind the culture wars of today, behind the death camps and the Crusades, behind Constantine and Judah the Prince, to the 1st century, allows Jews and Christians to recover shared roots with Jesus of Nazareth and his immediate followers. The effort does not forget the past 2,000 years, but neither does it allow those years to abort the conversation. For far too long, Jesus has been the wedge that drives Christians and Jews apart. I suggest that we can also see him as a bridge between us. The image is not meant to indicate that either of us cedes our own views of Jesus. The bridge spans two separate lands, and it does not mean we need to find common ground on everything. I do not envision Jews and Christians standing over a wide chasm and reciting the Lord's Prayer or the Kaddish or singing Kumbaya. Conversations across religions need not, and should not, end with all participants proclaiming an ultimate unity of belief. Such an exercise only waters down both traditions into a bland universalism that, in an attempt to be inoffensive, winds up offending everyone. Understanding of and appreciation for our neighbor's tradition are not the same thing as agreement with it. Jews and Christians will disagree. Jews will also disagree with other Jews, and Christians with other Christians. The day that Jews and Christians agree on everything is the day the Messiah comes, or comes back. The point of interfaith conversation is not to convert the person across the table, but it is also not to abdicate one's own theology for the sake of reaching agreement. Put another way, there is no reason for Jews and Christians to sacrifice their particular beliefs on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. The former Bishop of Sweden and Dean of Harvard Divinity School, Christer Stendahl, speaks appropriately of holy envy, that is, the appreciation of the beliefs and practices of another. By seeing Jesus as a Jew with regard to both belief and practice, Christians can develop a deeper appreciation for the teachings of the Church. To be sure, anyone engaged in biblical study, whether in the privacy of a living room or retreat center, reading with a church group, listening to tapes, or taking a class, can develop an impression of Jesus. Those who study the text for spiritual reasons will find a Jesus who speaks to them personally. As my students sometimes say, I read the text, and the Holy Spirit guides me. Yet even more can be done, or as I am wont to reply, give the Holy Spirit something to work with. In particular, I think the Spirit would appreciate a bit of historical investigation. Today, Jesus' words are too familiar, too domesticated, too stripped of their initial edginess and urgency. Only when heard through first-century Jewish ears can their original edginess and urgency be recovered. Consequently, to understand the man from Nazareth, it is necessary to understand Judaism. More, it is necessary to see Jesus as firmly within Judaism rather than as standing apart from it. And it is essential that the picture of Judaism not be distorted through the filter of centuries of Christian stereotypes. A distorted picture of first-century Judaism inevitably leads to a distorted picture of Jesus. Just as bad, if we get Judaism wrong, we'll wind up perpetuating anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic teachings, and thus the mission of the Church, to spread a gospel of love rather than a gospel of hate, will be undermined. For Christians, this concern for historical setting should have theological import as well. If one takes the incarnation, that is, the claim that the Word became flesh and lived among us, John chapter 1, verse 14, seriously, then one should take seriously the time when, place where, and people among whom this event occurred. Christians obtain yet another benefit in seeing Jesus in his Jewish context. For the recognition of Jesus' Jewishness and of his speaking in a Jewish idiom can also restore faith in the New Testament. doing just a bit of historical investigation provides a much-needed correction to America's Christ-saturated, albeit biblically ignorant, culture. For example, those who prefer the fiction of the Da Vinci Code over the facts of history, because the novel seems to enhance the role of women in early Christianity, will find that studies of the Jewish Jesus reveal the leadership roles and economic freedoms women had at the time. Moreover, such studies yield more options to women than the relegation of Mary Magdalene to the role of Mrs. Jesus. Those who prefer the Gospel of Judas over the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because they see it as eliminating anti-Jewish views from Christian origins, would do well instead to see how Jesus fits into his Jewish context. And that includes the notice that Judas does not, in the Gospels, represent the Jews. Jews, too, can learn much from appreciating Jesus within his Jewish context, for the New Testament texts preserve for Jews part of our own history. The stories of Jesus tell us a great deal about Jewish life in Galilee and Judea in the first century, and the only uncontested Pharisee from whom we have extant written sources is Paul of Tarsus. I find that the more I study Jesus, Mary Magdalene, James, Peter, and Paul in their own historical contexts, the more I come to appreciate my own Judaism, the diversity of its teachings, the richness of its encounter with the divine, the struggles it faced in accommodating to the Roman world. I appreciate, even find inspirational, the message of the kingdom of heaven, a message that spoke of the time when all debts are forgiven, and when those who have willingly give, without thought of reciprocity, to those who need. A time when we no longer ask, "Who is my neighbor?" but "Who acts as neighbor?" A time when we prioritize serving rather than being served. But as much as I admire much of the message, I do not worship the messenger. Instead, I find Jesus reflects back to me my own tradition, but in a new key. I also have to admit to a bit of pride in thinking about him. He's one of ours. If on the popular level we Jews are willing not only to acknowledge, but also to take pride in the Jewishness of such generally non-observant Jews as Sigmund Freud, Albert Einstein, the Marxes, Karl and Groucho, although Karl was baptized as a child, and Jerry Seinfeld, why not acknowledge the quite observant Jesus? Such recognition need not entail citing the Gospels in a bar mitzvah talk or in a Dvar Torah, an interpretation of the biblical reading for the week, although I have heard rabbis in Reform and conservative synagogues cite Homer, both the Greek poet and Bart's father, Plato, the Buddha, Muhammad, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., the Dalai Lama, and even Madonna, the Kabbalah-besotted singer, not the mother of Jesus. At least Jesus is Jewish with regard to family, practice, and belief. A critically aware, historically informed study of Jesus in his Jewish context does more than provide benefits to Christians and Jews alike. It aids in preventing the anti-Semitism that tends to arise when the history is not known. The concern to recover Jesus' Jewishness is these days particularly urgent. In churches and in the academy, in pronouncements made by Mexican Americans and Palestinians, women from Benin and men from Korea, the World Council of Churches, and Catholic liberation theologians, Jesus' Jewishness is frequently erased. In the churches, as Jesus continues to be the symbol for all that is socially good, Christian ministers and laity alike depict his Jewish background as the epitome of all that is wrong with the world. If Jesus preaches good news to the poor, so the common impression goes, the Jews must be preaching good news to the rich. If Jesus welcomes sinners, the Jews must have pushed them away. If Jesus speaks to or heals women, the Jews must have set up a patriarchal society that makes the Taliban look progressive. In the academy, certain schools of thought have managed to distinguish Jesus, whether implicitly or explicitly, from any sort of Judaism. The popular push to depict Jesus as a Galilean and see Galilee as religiously and ethnically distinct from Judea winds up conveying the impression that Judaism, with its temple and its leadership, is quite distinct from the Galilean Jesus. The popular image of Jesus as a peasant often serves not to connect him to his fellow Jews, but to distinguish him from them, since the Jews remain in the popular imagination not peasants, but Pharisees and Sadducees, or in academic terms, members of the retainer and elite classes. Worse, the lingering view that Jesus dismissed basic Jewish practices, such as the laws concerning Sabbath observance and ritual purity, turns Jesus away from his Jewish identity and makes him into a liberal Protestant. In liberation theology, that form of religious thought proclaiming that God has a preferential option for the poor and seeking to put biblical pronouncement in service to political and economic ends, Jesus is the pedagogue of the oppressed, the redeemer of the underclass, the hero of the masses. The problem is not the use of Jesus for political ends. The biblical material has always been, and should continue to be, used to promote a more just society. The problem is that the language of liberation all too often veers off into anti-Jewish rants. Jesus becomes the Palestinian martyr crucified once again by the Jews. He is the one killed by the patriarchal God of Judaism. He breaks down the barriers Judaism erects between Jew and Gentile, rich and poor, male and female, slave and free, and so can liberate all today. The intent is well-meaning, but the history is dreadful, and the impression given of Judaism is obscene. All of this appalling material results in good measure from the fact that Jews and Christians are ignorant of both their own history and the history of the other. The level of religious illiteracy is staggering. Jews and Christians share a common history, not all of it pleasant, as two recent books, James Carroll's Constantine's Sword and David Klinghoffer's Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, make abundantly clear. Yet, common history is not the same as common knowledge. In years of teaching about Jesus and the origins of Christianity, first at Duke University, then at Swarthmore College, and now at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, I have seen both the extent of the ignorance Jews and Christians have of each other and the unfortunate results of that ignorance. A substantial number of my Christian students viewed Jesus as opposed to Judaism, rather than as a Jew himself. They see Judaism as a religion of law, as opposed to Jesus' religion of grace. They believe that Jews follow the commandments to earn a place in heaven. They suggest that Jews rejected Jesus because he proclaimed peace and love instead of violence against the Roman occupiers of Jerusalem. Comments from my Christian students typically begin, "Why do the Jews think?" as if all Jews think alike. Christians tend to know even less of Judaism's legacy following the time of Jesus. A number of students assumed that all Jews strictly follow every single letter of Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. I've even been asked where Jews in urban areas keep animals needed for temple sacrifice. One young man inquired whether we needed to get a zoning variance for the practice. It came as no small disappointment to him to learn that animal sacrifice stopped with the destruction of the Second Temple in the mid-1st century CE. I have met Christian congregants who are stunned when I tell them that many, if not most, American Jews are not fluent in Hebrew, do not know intimately the plot lines of the Bible after the book of Exodus, do not keep kosher, and do not observe the laws of family purity, such as going to the mikveh, ritual bath. Some Christian students, and even a few Jews, are surprised to learn that Judaism has a very long and robust acknowledgement not only of an afterlife, but also of resurrection of the dead. Comparably few Christians have heard of the great Rabbi Hillel, unless they happened to stumble into a Hillel house on a college campus. Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Judah Hanassi, let alone Rashi, Maimonides.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?